In this video, I want to talk about the this binding for those event handlers we just set up. That includes the class methods handle pick, handle remove all, and handle add option. Now to kick off this conversation, let's just focus in on the options class. The options class has two methods, handle remove all and render. Now, when we first explored classes, we talked about how the methods are bound to the class instance. And in the class's example for the student class, for example, we were able to access things like data, this.major, and other methods on the class, things like this.hasMajor, which is defined up above. Now we already started doing that over here. We already referenced this.handleRemoveAll, which is a method defined elsewhere. That means that for render, the this binding is correct. We were able to access this.props.options and this.handleRemoveAll. But we've actually broken the binding for handle remove all itself. So let's go ahead and prove that by commenting out alert and trying to access some data like the options array. So I'm just going to log something to the screen, console.log, this.props.options, and that is exactly what we do down below. We access this.props.options and it works. All of the options are showing up. We would expect it to work here, but it's not going to. I'm going to save the file. Once the browser refreshes, we'll click that remove all button, and right here you can see we're getting an uncaught type error. Cannot read property props of null. So this error is letting us know that when we try to read props off of this, it's actually not available because this is null. So clearly we're losing the this binding. This no longer refers to our class instance. Now, the problem of losing your this binding is not specific to ES6 classes. It is not specific to React components, which means that we can actually explore it in isolation. We'll talk about exactly what's happening with the most basic example possible. We'll come up with a fix, then we'll apply that fix to our class-based components. We can go ahead and do this by creating a very simple object, const obj, and what we're going to do on this object is just set up a couple of values. First up, we're going to set name equal to whatever we like. I'm going to go ahead and use Vikram. We're then going to set up a single method getName, which is just going to return whatever that value is. Now, when we use ES6 classes, we can use the method definition, and we can actually also use that in our objects when we're defining methods. So here, the only difference is that we need commas. So we need a comma on the previous line, and if I was going to add something else on, I would want a comma after it as well. Now, in our case, we're not going to have anything after getName, so we can remove the comma and the age property. Now, the goal for getName is to just be really simple. We're going to return this.name, and if we called getName, it shouldn't be too surprising the value we get back. Console.log, object.getName. What's going to print to the screen? We can be pretty sure the string Vikram's going to print, and if we save it, that is exactly what we get. And now this example is very similar to the ES6 classes example where the this binding was working. Let's go ahead and make a very subtle tweak to this code and explore how that is actually going to break the this binding for getName. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to create a const. I'm going to call it getName, and I'm going to set it equal to obj.getName. Great. Now I have a reference to that method. I can go ahead and use getName instead of obj.getName. And down below, we're going to do just that, getName. I'm going to call it, save the file, and over inside of the browser, instead of seeing Vikram, we get an uncaught type error, just like we did before. Now, the actual value changed a little bit, but the message is still the same. Cannot read property name of undefined. So once again, by making a subtle tweak to our code, we've actually broken the this binding. So what's going on here? When we create getName, we are referencing obj.getName, and both try to run the exact same code. So in both of the examples, the working one and the not working one, the exact same code ran. A single statement where we try to return this.name. The problem is the context it ran in is very different. obj.getName is in the context of an object, so we have access to that object as the this binding. But when we break it out into a function like this, we actually lose that context. The context does not get transferred. Now we just have a regular function. Regular functions have undefined for their this by default, just like if I tried to create a const func and set it equal to an anonymous function. If I run this and try to access this, console.log this, we're going to get undefined, and we can prove that by calling func. If I save the program and rerun things, we see undefined prints before our error. So this is exactly what we're seeing down below. What we need to do is figure out how we can set the this binding in certain situations, and we're going to do that using the bind method available on functions in JavaScript. Bind is a method on a function, which means right here on getName, I can access bind, and we're going to want to call it. When we call it, we get our function back, which means that this and this are actually the exact same thing. If I run app.js and the program restarts, we still get our error. The function is still actually getting called. We're at least trying to access the name. The cool thing about bind, and the reason why it's actually useful, is that you can use the first argument to set the this context, which means that I can set it equal to that object, once again, bringing the context back to what we would expect. Now, if I go ahead and save app.js, what are we going to get over here? We get Vikram showing up to the screen. The error is now gone. Now you can pass whatever you want inside of here. I don't have to reference obj. For example, I could set up an inline object where name equals my name. I can save the program. And now I've forced the this context for getName to be that object. Accessing this.name now returns Andrew. So bind is a very handy tool. There are various places in JavaScript where we lose the this binding, and event handlers are one of them. You're going to see this if you use anything, even regular old vanilla JavaScript event handlers, jQuery, or anything else. So what we're going to go ahead and do is fix the binding using bind. Now we can remove all of this stuff. We're going to go ahead and actually implement this into our program. If you want to learn more about bind and where it lives on the web, I recommend using the Mozilla Developer Network docs as always. So you can Google MDN bind, and that's going to get you over to the right place. You can take a look at bind. You can go and dive deep into how it works, what arguments you can pass in. There are a ton of interesting properties of it, but we're just going to be using it to reset the context. Let's go ahead and do just that by integrating bind into our classes. And once again, we're going to start with options. So the goal is to be able to actually log out the options array inside of handle remove all. Now, there are a few different places you can use bind inside of your components. One of them is just right here. We reference the method like we did for the method in the plain object example. This gets called later, which breaks the this context. But if we call bind.bind, we can fix that by setting our own context. Now, in this case, render, it's not an event handler, so it's not going to lose that binding. Render has the correct this binding. We were able to access this.props and this.handle remove all. So what do we want to set the binding equal to? This. That is going to make sure the this binding for handle remove all has the exact same this binding as render has. If I save the program and click remove all, this time around, we are indeed getting the array showing up, which means the this binding was correctly set. Now this technique works, but it's a little inefficient. It requires us to rerun bind every time the component re-renders. And as our components re-render more and more often, that can get a little bit expensive. It requires us to do a bit more work than is really necessary. So what I'm going to do is remove this. That's actually going to once again break the program. And what we're going to do is override the constructor function for React component, like we saw over in the ES6 classes example for student. And we're going to go ahead and use that to fix the this binding for handle remove all. So step one is to define the constructor right here. Like we did for non-React component based classes, we just define it, constructor. We set up the arguments list, we set up the method body, and there we have it. Now the constructor function for React components actually does indeed get called with something. It gets called with the props object. So I'm going to define that right here. Props in the constructor function, it's exactly the same as this.props in the render method. It refers to the exact same thing. The constructor function just gets it passed in. Now, in order to make sure we don't break anything, we need to make sure to call super with the props. This is similar to how we called super over here to ensure that the values still got set, in this case, name and age. If we don't call super with the props, we're going to not have access to this dot props. So it's really important to do this. This is just the bare minimum. If you're going to override the constructor function, this does not add on any behavior. If we want to add on some behavior, we're going to define that down below. Now the goal here is to bind handle remove all. So what are we going to do? Well, we're actually going to set this.handle remove all equal to itself with a slight modification. So we're setting it equal to itself, handle remove all. And at this point, we've done nothing. We've set something equal to its own value. But what we're going to add is a call to bind right here at the end. .bind. Now, the constructor function is once again not an event callback like this.handleRemoveAll. So much like render, the context is correct by default. And we're just going to bind it to this. Now, when we do that, we are making sure that wherever we call handleRemoveAll, the context is correct, which means if I used it multiple times down below, I wouldn't have to type manual multiple bind calls in line. And that also means that I just run this binding once when the component first gets initialized. It does not need to get rebound every single time the component renders, which is way more efficient than the solution we had before. Now, if we go ahead and save app.js, we can take a look and make sure this still works. I'm going to click remove all, and right here, the array is once again showing up. So we have two ways to bind those event handlers. We can call bind inline in render, but that's not efficient. What we're going to be doing is calling bind in the constructor method. Now, there's no need to set up the bindings for the other two components, the action component and the add option component. What we're going to do in the next one is take a look at how we can start setting up our React components to render data and have that real-time binding. So when the data changes, automatically re-render the UI. That is in contrast to what we saw in JSX Indecision, where we needed to manually call render every single time we manually changed the data. I'm excited to get to it, so stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.